All right, everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to Yale Reese's last event of this crazy semester of fall 2020. It's a real pleasure to have with us as our guest today, Ian MacMillen. My name is Doug Rogers. I am the faculty director of the program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at Yale, and I teach in anthropology. I'll be introducing Ian. He'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. Ian, as I'm sure many of you know, is going to be lecturing in the Department of Music at Yale beginning in the spring term. Before that, he received his PhD in the anthropology of music from the University of Pennsylvania in 2012 and has taught at and held a variety of positions at Whitman College, Oberlin, the University of Pittsburgh, Yale. His research and writing has been enormously productive and varied over these years, including a 2019 book published by Wesleyan University Press called Playing It Dangerously, Tambura Bands, Race, and Affective Bloc in Croatia and Its Intimates, and a number of the articles that he's published, including some recent and in press ones, also deal with this intersecting theoretical and conceptual issue of affect, music, affect and music as they intersect with issues of race and racialization, particularly in, but not exclusively in, the Balkans. And Ian is an accomplished field researcher and is also working on another book for the University of Chicago Press, which is tentatively called Forgetting Out Loud, Music, Sound, and Affective Non-Memorials to 20th Century Violence. And this is based on fieldwork in Bulgaria, Croatia, Germany, and Serbia. That's just to give you a little piece of the enormously impressive and enormously varied kinds of perspectives that Ian brings to his work on the Balkans and beyond in the anthropology of music. So it's a real pleasure to introduce him today and to welcome him to the Reese community more broadly. His talk today has the wonderful title and the wonderful poster, African-American Performance in Post-Soviet World War II, Post-World War II Soviet and Yugoslav Space and Screens. So Ian, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Doug. Thanks for this wonderful introduction and for the opportunity to speak here today. My thanks to you as well as to Christina Andriatis and other staff at the program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, including student Kate Wentworth, who designed this wonderful poster that I've decided to use as my first slide here. For the past 10 years or so, I've been studying the use of jazz in Soviet films, particularly those from the post-World War II era, and political animated films especially, which were an important medium for the propagating of revolutionary ideas in a vast country where not all adults could speak or even read, speak, understand Russian. I work with an art historian, Masha Cole of Loyola Marymount University on this project. She's a specialist in 1950s and 60s posters and other forms of propaganda. And we see jazz as playing three very different roles in such films that divide these fairly neatly into three periods I'll discuss here briefly at the beginning. Beginning with pre-World War II, mostly in the 1930s, in which jazz is used in fairly non-political, uplifting, even fun scenes. These were aimed more at children than the post-war films I'll discuss, which were aimed more at adults. For instance, this one from 1937, A Noisy Voyage, in which the famous Soviet jazzman Tzvasman performs to accompany the rebuilding of a ship that's crashed on an island. So here it's used for constructive purposes, motivating the workers. But after World War II, suddenly jazz becomes the music of the villains. And in the early post-war years, through about 1961, 1962, it specifically is the accompaniment to corrupted Soviet characters, such as this 1957 film, The Familiar Images, in which we hear us accompanying a shopkeeper who is trying to sell all these Western, London, San Francisco, Paris-produced fashion, so capitalist countries, dresses to a woman who has the audacity to ask something that comes from Moscow, and he laughs hysterically at her.
Готового платья. Вот последние парижские модели. Вечерние туалеты из Лондона, найлоновые сарафаны из Сан-Франциско, спортивные туалеты. Это довольно мило. Но я вас умоляю, может быть, случайно осталось что-нибудь москва-швеевское? Москва-швеевская?
And this continues into the 60s and 70s, but switches suddenly to becoming music, again, of the villain, but in this case of corrupting foreigners, in most cases from the United States, but also sometimes from Western Europe. And this next scene does contain a representation of racialized violence, in which we see an African-American man, probably in Chicago or New York, who is struck trying to enter a whites-only establishment. Here, jazz accompanies this. Importantly, this is actually very early jazz, so far outdated. These films were not opportunities to listen to modern jazz. They were making political statements using outdated stuff from the 20s and 30s. Here also, we see this music paired not only with the scene of violence, but also with capitalist advertisements for Coca-Cola, in which African-American faces are also used exploited for this capitalist purpose. I'm going to focus mostly on the second period today, but we'll also give some historical overview of the presence and the actions of people of African descent in the first period that can help us to contextualize what went on after World War II. Soviet history is often divided, not so much by, not only along lines of when World War II intervenes, but also into Stalinist and post-Stalinist periods in particular, which recognizes the important change in leadership, but also in the nature of authoritative ideological discourse that followed Stalin's death in 1953, and especially a speech denouncing Stalin given by Nikita Khrushchev, the next in line, the person who takes over the reins, in 1956. Well, that's when he gives this speech denouncing Stalin. Our periodization disrupts this narrative to a certain extent. It traces continuities from the late Stalinist period well past the beginnings of Khrushchev's thawing of Cold War relations and into the 1960s. The shift that we recognize that happens in this later period in 62, 63 came well after his speech denouncing Stalin. To a certain extent, we might simply see this as a trickle-down effect where changes implemented in the 1950s, such as the opening to people coming in from the US, jazz ambassadors, for instance, prompts responses later on in domestic films. But it's also true that we can stretch things that are often associated with Khrushchev's thaw backward and recognize their presence in the last years of Stalinism. So looking at jazz in animated film, where the possibilities for jumping in and out of officially sanctioned socialist realist aesthetics were great because of the medium, can, we argue, turn our attention to important forms of experimentation with visual and musical aesthetics since the late 1940s. Stalin reportedly liked jazz and had Soviet artists perform in the Kremlin, while Khrushchev in 1957 actually denounced jazz after visiting the US. This is often seen then as cementing the importance of jazz in the cool warfare between the Soviet Union and the US, but also Western Europe and other parts of the world, as jazz diplomacy, as ambassadors for the US musicians, took off in the 1950s, first with Music USA, a program beginning on the Voice of America radio broadcast in 1955, but also jazz ambassadors who started traveling for the US in 1956. This could be seen as another reason for recognizing the shift from Stalinism to Khrushchev as important and as a turning point for Soviet history and the politics of jazz. But we see jazz as already being used critically in an earlier period, already being used as both a target and a device of propaganda from the late 1940s. And this timeline aligns better with the anti-racist activities of African American musicians inside and outside of the Soviet Union than it does simply with this history of shifts from the white Russian leadership and shifting leadership in the US. Finally, a third reason for our disrupting this somewhat standard narrative of the mid-20th century has to do with the fact that Khrushchev's split with Stalinism wasn't the first. Yugoslavia's leader had made one from within the socialist bloc from Yugoslavia in 1948, which would have an important impact on the geography and the geometry of Cold War relations as Yugoslavia established itself as a leader of the non-aligned movement, meaning that the Cold War would not simply be bilateral or bidirectional. This would have an important impact also on jazz then, and on jazz diplomacy in the region. It was suggested that for today's talk, giving some coverage of Yugoslavia, which is my major research area outside of the project I'm presenting today, and thus not focusing only on the Soviet Union, could add something to today's program and to coverage of diversity in a broader range of the regions covered by the program in Rees. But I also want to use this as an opportunity to think about jazz tours and jazz media in more than a bidirectional US-Soviet confrontation, and to see what this can tell us about the activity of African-American artists and the question of periodization with which I have started today. People of African descent, mostly African-American, but also some Afro-Caribbean migrants, began arriving in the Soviet Union shortly after the revolution of 1917, attracted to the ideal of a multiracial utopia that the Soviet Union was broadcasting widely. The historian Maksim Maklusievich writes that, quote, "Their very presence in the Soviet Union became an identity-building device for the Soviets, who cast much of their polemic with the West in terms of a contest for moral superiority. Surely to extend acceptance and friendship to people of color the world over, and to host some in their midst, was to challenge the capitalist adversaries on the issue of race relations, the issue where, for obvious historical reasons, the capitalists appeared most vulnerable," close quotation. Some of these migrants settled for good. Many others, such as the actor and singer Paul Robeson and the writer Langston Hughes, came for specific projects and collaborations. Others came and stayed for a few years. This history was celebrated in the famous Soviet film Tirk, meaning the circus, from 1936, which portrayed a white circus actor and her half-black child who flee the racism of the USA for the acceptance they find in the Soviet Union. The child actor here was actually the son of an African-American migrant and a Soviet-born mother. But at the same time, as we've already seen, jazz was being used fairly uncritically in happy-go-lucky feature and animated films that drew heavily on Hollywood aesthetics and did not engage in such critiques. Over in Yugoslavia, which was founded as an independent country around the same time as the Soviet Union was established, but emerged as a kingdom, officially known as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes in 1918, the attraction of Black stars such as Josephine Baker was really important. She had faced major problems in the United States for her race and for her sensual, even racy presentation on stage as a dancer and singer. And she had resettled in Paris and become a star there. Bringing someone like this in for concerts in Yugoslavia, which happened in 1929, was important for being part of these broader European cultural, fashion, and music trends. After World War II, there was a shift, though, toward far more people of African descent coming directly from Africa. So no longer the large numbers of African-American and Afro-Caribbean migrants. Instead, students were coming in from newly independent post-colonial countries in Africa. This began in the 1950s in the Soviet Union, but picked up especially with the creation of a Moscow-based university created for this purpose in 1960. And by the late 1960s, was attracting thousands of students each year. And some of them, of course, stayed or had children who stayed. The African Americans who did come during this period were often cultural elites. Later, by the 1970s, this would also include cultural elites hired by the US government to help gain sympathetic understandings for the United States and its cultures, in particular, jazz artists like Duke Ellington. A similar trend was happening in Yugoslavia, which after Tito's split with Stalin in 1948, had been hard at work building political relationships and cultural solidarity with former colonial countries, leading to the first meeting of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade, Yugoslavia in 1961, which was a close collaboration in particular with India and with Egypt. Student visitors from Africa, but also from Indonesia and Latin America were a highly publicized part of this. So this is the context in which the US State Department began sending cultural ambassadors to these and other countries. As many scholars have noted, this was a challenging project. Jazz had enormous appeal abroad, but was also rightly seen as caught up in the exploitation and the disenfranchisement of African-American citizens who were often patronized by white clientele in venues that otherwise did not permit Black people to enter. As in the United States, there was also the issue of the great, sometimes greater popularity in Europe of specifically white performers, such as Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman. So African-American traditions often were put to use by non-African-American performers. This was perhaps slightly less the case in Yugoslavia than it was in the Soviet Union. And we'll explore both of these areas. Within Yugoslavia, for programs there, on the one hand, the US State Department really got going fairly early with cultural ambassadors, jumping at the opportunity that the Tito-Stalin split presented. And European Americans were some of their first recruits. The Tamburitsins, a tambura cordophone and dance ensemble with which I've worked, that for a long time was based at Duquesne University, drew its membership in the 50s largely from students of Croatian, Serbian, and some other East European backgrounds from throughout the US and Canada. In 1950, they did their first Yugoslav tour, performing largely South Slavic repertoire, but also some cowboy and Western sets for the State Department. And as one of their former leaders told me in an interview, quote, "This was at the behest of the State Department to make closer ties with Tito and his brand of communism when he broke ties with Stalin and the Communist Coalition," close quotation. In 52 and 62, they also made trips on their own, which was more feasible in many respects in Yugoslavia than it was in the Soviet Union. And they added more Americana, traditions like the Charleston, seen here in the upper right-hand corner. This is a dance that originated with African-American performers in the Southeast United States, in Charleston in particular, made famous by performers just like Josephine Baker, for instance. The US State Department would fund this ensemble again to make tours on their own behalf, taking advantage of this increased awareness of Americana through the performances that the Tamburitsins themselves had sponsored. In 68, they went to Latin America, in 69 to the Soviet Union, where they added further African-American derived styles like Dixieland jazz and rock and roll. Of course, these were not the only ensembles who could tour Yugoslavia without US backing. Josephine Baker returned there from Paris in 1958 and in 1968, and actually in the 1970s, the leader of Yugoslavia, Tito, secured her an island off of Yugoslavia's Adriatic coast for building the sort of international, interracial education institute that she had long hoped to found. This, of course, was also very much in keeping with the aims of Yugoslavia's participation in the non-aligned movement and in its own development of educational programs. But the State Department did start sending African-American musicians as well to Yugoslavia as part of its very first jazz ambassador program. This was a 10-week tour by an 18-piece band that was racially integrated and diverse in terms of gender, and led by the famous trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie. They performed in Iran, in Pakistan, Lebanon, Turkey, Greece, but also importantly in Yugoslavia. And here's Dizzy Gillespie speaking a little bit about this tour.
The people who we're planning to use, my friend Dizzy Gillespie, who's the father of modern jazz.
What do you think about that, Dizzy?
I don't think we have any trouble converting the people over to our style of music.
You think they'll dig that?
I think they'll dig it very nicely.
This is what you might call a cool war, rather than a cold war.
Very good. The weapon that we will use is the cool one.
chose Dizzy because he was famous. He already had an international following. But what was not clear, I think, to the State Department, that Dizzy had a history of political activism. He was once a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, not so much because he believed in it, but because in the 1930s, you can get a gig at a CP event. Here's someone who was always very outspoken about civil rights and human rights. So he was the unlikely choice politically. He was a very likely choice in the commercial realm.
He was not going to sugarcoat some of the horrors that was going on to black people at that time. He was not going to get America off the hook. And that's what he said. And we all basically felt the same way.
This approach that Gillespie took seems in many ways actually to have helped. He wasn't received as someone who is in Yugoslavia or any of the other countries, as someone who was there to paint a perfectly rosy picture of America during the struggles of the civil rights movement and all the acts of racialized violence that it was addressing. They performed, but they also interacted and formed friendships with musicians in the countries. So here in this photograph, we actually see him with the Yugoslav composer Mjesecu in Zagreb in 1956. And jazz around this time was also becoming a prominent part of filmmaking, and in particular of the Zagreb School of Animated Film in the 50s and 60s. Another composer, Stipica Karađorđe, who's actually the brother of the composer pictured with Gillespie in the last slide, composed the jazz influence score for Cow on the Moon from 1959. Unlike with Soviet films, these directed by Dusan Vukotić do not highlight jazz as an object of critique or even particular attention within the film. The composers rather draw influence from late bebop and modal jazz and more contemporary styles than in Soviet films to inspire their own avant-garde compositions. That was sometimes the case with Soviet film scores, but they also looked to earlier forms of jazz, and always with the intention of drawing attention to jazz as a political medium and as an object of critique. In Yugoslav films, the plots too seem less concerned with politics than with more general statements about interpersonal relationships. So even in the context of a film created at the beginning of the space race, we're arguing that there's not really much of a political commentary being launched here. We could talk about that in the Q&A if there's any other ideas anyone has. This might be an important question then. So if jazz is meant to blend into the aesthetic in these films and not to stand out as a subject in and of itself, what about characters of color? Are they represented in Yugoslav films? Are they absent, part of the whitewashing that otherwise sometimes characterized jazz's appearance in the country? In Vukotić's films, there is a general distinction between the majority yellowish white characters and less frequently appearing characters who have dark complexions, some of which by coloring seem to suggest representations of blackness, brownness, redness, representations that were widespread in treatments of racial difference in the period. The most famous work of the Zagreb Animated Film School, Vukotić's Surrogate, which won an Oscar in 1962, plays up the contrast between the solid, muscular, and ultimately darker complexion of a romantic rival and the light-skinned hollowness of the main character and his girlfriend, who appear with Juan Moreau-like flatness. We earlier see that the main character actually created his surrogate partner, his girlfriend, by inflating her from a small flat shape using a hand pump. The main character's nervous vocal scatting, along with what has sometimes been described as the modernist score, modernist jazz score in this film, also contrasts with what we are seemingly meant to hear in the film as the emotionally more evocative and more melodious brass parts whose classical and jazz stylings emphasize the connection between the woman and the romantic rival. There isn't really enough background story or political context in most of these films to indicate intention of interracial discourse, interracial contact. But in the context of foreign and typically male students and musicians of color visiting and often marrying Yugoslav women, it is certainly possible to see this film as registering, perhaps even critiquing, anxiety over romantic competition with racialized rivals. To the extent that racial difference might appear, though, it seems to have nothing to do with critiques of American structural or interpersonal racism. These films were intended for international audiences, including American ones. After Vukotić won the Oscar, he went on to work increasingly with American producers and even songwriters, typically of white, Anglo-Saxon and Jewish backgrounds, thus using modern jazz and pushing at its boundaries with their own avant-garde interpretations was part of a Yugoslav internationalism. Turning to the Soviet Union, a couple of prominent actions by famous African-American musicians with tours scheduled in the Soviet Union contributed to a very different tone towards jazz and towards critical commentary on international politics in the films that were being produced in Moscow at the same time. The famous activist and singer and actor Paul Robeson went to the Soviet Union in 1949. There he gave speeches, published essays, importantly this one, Songs of My People in Sovetskaya Muzika in 1949, in which he wrote, quote, "Under capitalist conditions where all forms and expressions of American art must subordinate themselves to the demands of the market, our native Negro music has been subjected to the very worst exploitation. Commercial jazz has prostituted and ruthlessly perverted many splendid models of Negro folk music and has corrupted and debased many talented Negro musicians in order to satisfy the desires of capitalist society." A year after Gillespie visited Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union was also set to receive an African-American jazz ambassador working for the State Department, but Louis Armstrong withdrew to protest the federal and state government's hindering of the integration of the Little Rock Nine. These were the first 9 students enrolled in a formerly white high school in Arkansas. He would later tour parts of Africa and Asia for the State Department in 1961, and in 1965, he did eventually go to East Germany and to Hungary, but his rebuke of the US government in 1957 was significant. The State Department told journalists that Soviet propagandists would surely seize on his statement that, quote, "the way they are treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell," close quotation. In the 1950s, white musicians toured close satellites of the Soviet Union, but not African-American musicians. It would take until 1962 before a famous jazz musician finally went to the Soviet Union for the State Department, and that was Benny Goodman, another popular white musician, albeit backed on the tour by his characteristically integrated black and white band. Students toured the Soviet Union for the State Department as well, including a choir from Oberlin Conservatory in 1964. These clips from a recent documentary about that trip detail experiences of Joy Blackett, a soprano originally from Bermuda. They speak to the continuing and immense popularity in the Soviet Union of spirituals, particularly "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child," a song which Paul Robeson had made famous in a 1933 Soviet film about American racism. The clips also speak to the lack of familiarity and to the epidermal fixation of race thinking with which many Soviet citizens approached people of African descent.
The first performance was the debut at the Leningrad Philharmonic. And near the end of the concert, I stepped forward to sing my solo and looked out and was a bit overwhelmed. The choir hummed me in. It was the most beautiful sound to slide off into my solo. It was cosmic. And I always felt that sometimes I feel like a motherless child that got tremendous attention. It was 50% the Oberlin College Choir of 1964 in terms of beauty. I got through singing and I heard this sound, a moose, right? Moose. I thought they were booing me. Somebody said, no, that's Krava in Russian. I heard the sound and I looked up at the tiered balconies and daffodils. Thousands of daffodils were pouring on me, over me, and I realized they liked it. And so there was this ovation that went on for moments. And I stepped back into the choir, and it was otherworld. It was just a beautiful, beautiful experience. Some of them recognized me because there were only 3 African Americans. I was Bermuda-born, but African Americans in the choir. And they would tell me they thought I was pretty, and then I understood that much Russian. And they would often proceed to rub me. Usually, you know, we were completely covered, and my hands would be exposed, and they would rub, and they would be amazed that the brown didn't come off. And they looked at me questioningly and kept going, you know, very admiringly. I took it. And I found it very amusing. There was really nothing I felt devastated about, but it happened really often. And I would rub them back and go, oh, where's yours? What are you gonna do?
Not everyone took it with so much humor. Journalist Yelena Khanga, who is descended from both African and African-American immigrants to the Soviet Union, similarly describes staying with a boyfriend's parents and the mother checking to see whether Khanga's color had transferred to sheets, an experience that she saw as oppressively restricting her ability to integrate into Soviet society. The Soviet Union was far from a racial utopia. While Afro-Russians did not face the same systemic racial violence that often did African Americans in the US, Robeson would typically dedicate part of his speeches there to standing up for Jewish artists who were continuing to disappear in disproportionate numbers in the late Stalinist purges, which were starting to catch his attention. But at the same time, many of the official criticisms of American racism were spot on. Integrated jazz and choir tours did a long way toward demonstrating another side of US culture. And then not surprisingly, Soviet films began countering these, using jazz not as a soundtrack for corrupted Soviet characters, but as the medium and also the example par excellence of racist capitalist exploitation by white Americans, who were suddenly becoming a palpable threat or presence in the Soviet Union through their travels abroad. The Family of Mr. Twister, this film from '63, which we watched a clip of earlier, they, for instance, go to Leningrad in the film and are appalled to have to share a hotel with a guest from sub-Saharan Africa, who is there representing the internationalism of the Soviet Union within the film. The emergence of this trend of representing Americans in the films, the fact that it emerges only in the late years of the thaw, shows the lasting potency of earlier critiques sustained into the 1960s through the actions of men like Paul Robeson and Louis Armstrong, who refused to be part of jazz's American transference to Soviet milieus. In the films from this middle period, from 1948 on to 1961 or more, jazz, though used cautiously and sparingly, is never the music of Americans, but always of Soviet citizens who have fallen from grace. At a time when Yugoslav films were using it to court and to represent internationalist cooperation, Soviet films were using it to warn of the dangers of visiting bourgeois cosmopolitans. To get into this earlier period, I'm going to read a section of a paper that Masha Kohl and I are presenting or working on developing at the moment. In this period that for the sake of shorthand we call the long 1950s, jazz motivated seemingly irreconcilable Disney-inspired naturalism and modernist self-reflexivity. While late Stalinist forms of cultural control survived Khrushchev's reforms, denunciations of Stalin and his authoritarian model, if broadly imaginable after World War II, were latent in the peculiarly polyphonic conclusions, in Bakhtin's sense, of suppressed musical and visual voices. These are found in correspondences between the use of American swing and hot jazz recordings with the stylistic cacophony that the artists introduced. Jazz appeared sparingly in films noteworthy for their initial and long-term success and for their famed directors, writers, and actors. The convergences of varied media both afforded an experimental openness during the years of strictest control and also highlighted periods of epoch-bridging aesthetic stability. Cultural ideologist Andrei Zhdanov's 1948 speech against continuous dissonance, unharmonic music, and jazz-inspired compositions by Aram Khachaturian and Dmitry Shostakovich suggested a new party stance on jazz. Although Stalin reportedly liked jazz, the party stance became official in 1949 when the Secretary of the Union of Soviet Composers organized a kind of traveling inquisition of jazz performers in the newly expanded communist bloc. Animators, on the other hand, drew liberally on Disney's style, another favorite of Stalin's. Following the state studio's directive, artists turned away from the political films that characterized the industry's reemergence at the end of the war and created an atemporal world removed from everyday life and topical issues. Jazz's appearance in such Disney-like films from 1949 onward could no longer remain unqualified during late Stalinism, however, and its negative post-war coding thus occasioned both unusual visual experimentation and relatively rare engagements with timely cultural politics within the medium. The 1949 animated film A Foreign Voice, or Someone Else's Voice, is emblematic of several post-war shifts. Like many apolitical films of the period, its characters were not humans, but animals, birds in this case. Their fluid, naturalistic movements are accompanied by equally socialist realist orchestration and birdsong solos. Jazz interrupts in a performance by a magpie who returns from abroad with Josephine Baker-styled jewelry. This presents an anxiety regarding the Soviet body and its potential corruption by what Zhdanov called, quote, foreign bourgeois influences prompting crazy attempts to replace treasures of Soviet musical culture by the pitiful tatters of modern bourgeois art, close quotation. In the Magpie's performance, a by then outdated American hot jazz recording provides or supplants her voice. This was fairly innovative. Hot jazz departed wildly from orchestral swing rhythms permitted in pre-war films. Replacing the vocals with a trumpet solo also moved away from simple diegetic musical presentation in which characters would witness solos performed by instruments as one would in actual Soviet life, and not, as in this case, actually replacing the vocals. These changes cast jazz as a target, but also as a device of ideological critique. The message was made transparent via voiced narration, the avian public's condemnation, and the music's uncontrollable motivation of discontinuous musical and visual motions that broke from socialist realist tradition into daringly modernist gestures. Noteworthy are the skips in the gramophone playback, laying bare the device behind a voice truly foreign to the body that it overpowers.
Такое слушать не по мне. Коли выступать она в концертах захотела, так лучше лучше бы туда летела, где это пение в цене.
So this form of whistling, this is the equivalent of booing. This is what Joy Black would have had to worry about, this sort of response here. This film ushered in jazz's long-standing use as a device motivating modernist self-referentiality, and also as an other voice, or as a foreign voice, whether, as in this case, a diegetic replacement of an antagonist's vocality, or, as in other films, a non-diegetic narrative that comments subtly on the deleterious actions of the characters on screen, something that we can hear as commentary, but that the characters do not respond to. The thaw initiating with Khrushchev's 1956 denunciation of Stalin's cult of personality and authority liberalized cultural expression, and animated films were repoliticized to provide clear reminders of socialist ideals. This shift in the ideals did not affect the plots of jazz films, which simply remained political, but changes in discourse informed transformations of the standard characters from animal to humans, of forms of neutral narration whose authority and objective distance are undermined, and transformations of modernist visuals, Disney-like naturalist figures, in addition to being propelled by jazz into discontinuous movements and collage-like forms, now lost their requisite fullness and became schematized. Familiar Images of 1957 embodies a hybrid of cinematic and animated media. The heavily made-up star comedian Arkady Raikin performs caricature in filmed sections and voices characters in the animation. The storytelling is interrupted with Raikin's character multiply splintered. The opposition of an anatomically proper human body, which is the unassailable subject of socialist realist art, and its opposition here with a disarticulated, two-dimensional abstracted representation set the stage for a larger cultural critique and for modernist deformation. Raikin, who is transformed through makeup into something like a cartoon, reveals the animated vignette to be a flat picture, and even the vignette shop owner exposes the formal flatness of fashion from Paris and San Francisco. This is not unlike the Zagreb School's experiments, but here it's justified by a critique that is made clear through the use of jazz. Soviet audiences accustomed to socialist realist melodic smoothness, or to these audiences who were accustomed to socialist realist melodic smoothness, jazz's denial of an organic blend of instruments, as with the splintered protagonist, announced the elements by which it is constituted with a quasi-modernist truth to material, an exposition of formalist imagination at the expense of Raikin's narration and of the officially approved satire. There are always, of course, continuities to trace across any particular epochal break. What we can gain by considering the long 1950s is a sense of jazz's consistent use under different leaders as a foreign voice, in films with only Soviet characters and with a narrative voice commenting on the relationship to jazz and other aspects of Western culture. Bakhtin had earlier introduced the idea of the Chuzhoe Goles, which happens to be the same name given this film, back in the 1920s as he began to formulate his theories of non-centralized authorship, polyphonic authority, and what he calls the dialogic in texts. Examining music and visuals in tandem reveals that jazz itself manifested a foreign voice, an alien power that in its pejorative yet dialogic inclusion alongside modernist visuals challenged the authority of univocal narration under late Stalinism, even before Khrushchev-era visual and textual experimentation began to undermine the authoritative narrative figure. As jazz manifested polyphony transmedially and transnationally, the Cold War became as much about dialogue as about division. So if we return to this issue of periodization, we could think about how this dialogue, at least in part, had to do with the conversation between the visual and musical aesthetics and experimentation with these in particular, where jazz justified modern animation aesthetics and creative, even playful work, otherwise deemed unfit for socialist realist cartoons. We might also see other political actors as part of this opening of authoritative discourse into a more polyphonic web of relations and communication. This encompasses efforts such as those by Josip Broz Tito, his move, for instance, to stake out a non-Soviet aligned foreign policy, leading to Stalin's expelling Yugoslavia from the Komintern, but also later to new negotiations for rapprochement that he negotiated on and off with Khrushchev into the 1960s. At the same time, this gesture might also include the work of cultural and not just political actors. The courting of American collaborations by film and music industry elites within Yugoslavia and within Yugoslavia's schema of socialist self-management also played a role in the negotiation of authoritative discourse. The awarding to Vukotić of an Academy Award within a year of Yugoslavia taking the lead in coordinating the non-aligned movement, and also within a year of one of its citizens, Ivo Andrić, winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, certainly helped to bring a weight, perhaps even an air of legitimacy to the country's path. This was a path that the musicians and animators in Moscow were also looking to and were also responding to with their own agency as artists. Yet we should also think about the voices of actors who did not simply give legitimacy to their state powers, to the state powers with which they had aligned themselves. And I will end on this point. We might also think about Paul Robeson's speeches against jazz, but also on behalf of Jewish musicians and other artists in the Soviet Union, about the work, but also the anti-racist resistance of Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie with respect to the State Department music programs. We might think about the provocations and the charity work of Josephine Baker in both capitalist and communist countries. Understanding these films' artistic and political uses requires first acknowledging how such actions, too, are felt in the visual and sonic dialogue with jazz, in which Soviet animated films engaged throughout this 15-year post-war period. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I welcome questions and discussion.
Ian, thank you so much for that just fascinating and detailed and wide-ranging talk. So the protocol we're using is I'll ask anyone who's joining us today to type their questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and then I'll sort of pick them and hand them over to Ian from there. So please use the Q&A feature rather than the chat. And while you are doing that, maybe I'll get started, which is a question that occurred to me, which will show some of my ignorance of some of the details. But I really appreciated the way in which your inclusion in a quite complex and multidimensional way of the Yugoslav story in counterposition to the Soviet story made, for me at least, my understanding of this period and issues of race and cultural production and music, much more diverse than the sort of standard U.S. story that I've assimilated. And the question occurred to me, does that story end with Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, the two most multi-ethnic states of the Soviet bloc, or is there also a Polish and a Romanian and a Hungarian? Are there more dimensions to this? That I didn't hear you mention other Soviet bloc countries in Josephine Baker's tours or some of the other things you were talking about. So it occurred to me, are there still more dimensions in the Soviet bloc to this kind of a story, or not so much?
Well, there's so many more dimensions, and I wanted to limit this certainly to what is probably already a less than manageable array of things.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is
with Josephine Baker. That's a good question. I'm actually not sure whether she toured in other communist East European countries after World War II, or countries that became communist after World War II. I'll have to look into that. I'd be curious if anyone else joining us today might happen to know that. My sense is that she was really seen as part of this Paris milieu to which Soviet emigres had, those who left in the 1920s, artists, visual artists, musicians were attracted to. And so she was very much, again, as someone who was kind of both racialized and sexualized, and also played a big role in her own portrayal as a sensual being, was seen as very problematic and part of this sexualized exploitation of people of non-European descent in Western Europe. And so within the Soviet Union, she was an easy target, even if sometimes by way of these gestures. But certainly the other players in all this are the countries outside of Europe where these musicians did tour for the State Department, not for the State Departments. In Africa in particular, I think was important for the negotiations between Soviet Union and powers like West Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, members of the aligned movement. And so, Louis Armstrong refused to go to the Soviet Union, but he did go to Egypt, he did go to Congo, other parts of Africa, and that was an important part of his program. To the extent to which we can point to, say, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, other communist countries, and think about negotiations of blackness and of jazz. I mean, certainly they were the kind of stand-ins for sending these white figures. So Willis Conover, the person who gave the time for jazz, the Jazz Hour, part of Music USA, the Voice of America radio broadcast, in which he introduced jazz or helped introduce jazz to many parts of the world. He went there accompanying jazz musicians and was actually better received often than the jazz musicians themselves when he went to parts of communist Central Europe. Dave Brubeck goes to Poland in 1958. So Poland was kind of this intermediary area in the 1950s for negotiations of jazz. And this is where Khrenekov, the director, the secretary of the Soviet Composers Union, went there to kind of put the foot down on regulating jazz. And so in that regard, it was certainly the case that other parts of Eastern Europe were a battleground for this cultural warfare, but often absent that direct intervention in these political contexts of African-American musicians, I think in large part because, Louis Armstrong withdrew, right? Refused to go. And so they fell back on what probably seemed like safer opportunities, safer options, people who might not react as strongly to the deeply racist forms of institutional segregation and violence going on in the US at that time.
That's great, thank you. I invite questions from our audience. Even though you are invisible, I am sure that you have questions or comments or other engagements with various pieces of what Ian has presented here. So Ian, a question here from Michael Orlansky. In the 1950s and 60s, did musical groups from Yugoslavia and or the Soviet Union do concert tours in the US under US government sponsorship? So what does the other side of these potential exchanges look like?
Yeah, so the Bolshoi Ballet was a favorite of the Soviet Union's to send abroad. They came, I think, on a number of tours, and the director of the Duquesne University Tamburitsins, so this group that had first started making tours in Yugoslavia, but later went on to do State Department tours in South America and in the Soviet Union, but also Romania, and I think again in Poland, commented that they were well aware in '69 that their trip to the Soviet Union was in exchange for the US receiving the Bolshoi Ballet. Yugoslavia, things were a little bit less formalized. I just think if I can come up with a good example of a group that came with sort of official sponsorship, but I mean, the film industry was a huge site of collaboration between Hollywood and, which was a non-state sponsored set of industrial movers and shakers, and film industry in Yugoslavia, which was very carefully and enthusiastically watched by Tito himself for these types of collaborations. And those collaborations happened in both countries' territories. And so in that regard, you often had collaborations, perhaps more in film than in music. But yes, there were certainly lots of ensembles who toured for dance, for music between these countries. This was not, again, limited by any means to the US and the Soviet Union. For sake of time, I left out one of my favorite clips, which is of a non-animated film made in the 1980s in Yugoslavia, a film called Bal na vodi, which means dance on the water, that focuses back on the early period, 52, 53, and not just the fascination with American music, but also with Mexican music. So the fad of mariachi bands in these countries that were being courted by the for the non-aligned movement once it was established as such in the 1960s, but it also were a source of potential collaborations for Tito's government back in the early 50s.
Yeah, next question from Jeff Rubin. What was the official Soviet government reaction to the jazz ambassador tours? Were they seen as strictly propaganda or something more nuanced? Do you have a sense of that?
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for joining us today. Yeah, I think again, the answer is a bit of both. Certainly from the standpoint of Soviet ideologues, were seen as a play, something that was being put forward with very strictly ideological reasons. They wanted to make their own counters. So the last question got to this, the fact that they were able to make these exchanges and send their own musicians, their own dancers abroad was important. That said, there were a lot of Soviets who liked jazz, and there were a lot of Soviet ideologues who liked jazz, and Stalin seems to have been a particularly powerful and important one in that regard, although it was often handled sort of in private. You could get local jazz musicians like Svassman, like mjesecu, to come and play in his private residence or in his office. But people liked jazz, and in particular, so hiring musicians, again, who were not playing the wildest stuff. They're going to send Louis Armstrong, who was a star back in the 20s and 30s, and still a big name, certainly in the 50s and 60s, but wasn't considered really at the forefront of jazz in the way that Gillespie was. Even Gillespie by the 50s is not such a mover and a shaker in terms of pushing into modal and other forms of kind of more avant-garde jazz that were emerging by the late 50s. So these somewhat musically safe musicians were seen as an easy game to play, I think, on both sides, both the American and the Soviet one. So the Duke Ellington finally goes and has a black presence in jazz, touring for the US Department in 1971, I believe. Again, someone who made his career, made his name 40 years earlier. So this is a trend that we can see, and that I think made this in some ways an easier thing to accept. And people were widely cognizant of the fact that that jazz was well established in the Soviet Union. There have been people making films with jazz musicians, local jazz musicians, for 20, 30 years by this point. And this wasn't going away. And so in some ways, having these well organized and easy forms of exchange were a desirable alternative to thinking about people going out and bootlegging albums by Miles Davis.
Other questions? Ian, a question from Claire Ruzian. Thank you for this fascinating talk. I'm wondering if you could contextualize the use of jazz in Soviet animation more broadly in the context of Soviet responses to US animation. I'm thinking of how much jazz is used in US animation and anecdotally, how influential US animation seems to have been on Soviet animation in this period. In other words, is there any way we can see the use of jazz in Soviet animated films as a response to US animation, which also used a lot of jazz, including in representations of Black people, often very offensive ones, say in Dumbo?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's one that I think about a lot. There's a lot to be said about jazz in American animation. When I talk to people who grew up in the late Soviet period or even early post-Soviet period, for them, jazz is simply the music of the villain, and that's kind of became the standard there. I don't think it's really such here in the United States, although there are certain, jazz is a kind of, by this point in the mid-20th century, in the 50s and 60s, it's incredibly diverse in its styles. So that's a whole other conversation, what goes into being considered jazz in the American context. But there's certainly, I think, we could recognize certain tropes of dialogue, perhaps, between Soviet and American or Hollywood-based animation from the time period. The use of jazz simply as kind of a fun or less serious side lends itself well, I think, to both negative and positive portrayals. And we perhaps see a little bit of this in that Yugoslav film, the first of the two that I showed, Cow on the Moon, which is set in or was created in the period of the early space race, but really seems to be more about relationship between a young girl who's an engineer or a budding engineer and an older boy who isn't exactly a villain, but is a bit mischievous and kind of bullying her at times. And these portrayals seem to draw upon the longstanding use of jazz, but also other, I think, brass and wind instrument heavy animation. So if we think back also to Fantasia and the use of brass music in Mickey Mouse's scene where he's getting into trouble there. The musical style, certainly we can place in terms not only of jazz and its political relevance or symbolism, but also simply in kind of this long-standing trend of using fast-paced and boisterous music to show similar actions here. With Soviet animation, the reaching for examples, I think, is a bit different than in animation in the United States at this time period, specifically because we're often shown ways in which this is coming out of the exploitation, in particular, of Black audiences. So part of this discourse has to do with the villain, but it's also the music of victimization, which I don't think it is in, for example, that Dumbo example. I'll have to go back and rewatch that to think about how I flesh that out fully. But this is the music often of victimization. And so that's an important difference in Soviet film, that they're trying to portray the exploitation that's happening on the part of business owners, that's happening largely by those in power, people who are politically but also racially advantaged in the American societies that portray, or in kind of absentia, when we talked about the earlier period of characters coming back from Western Europe or from North America having taken on these musical styles. But they also represents it also demonstrates the violence inflicted upon these people, sometimes literally. In the case we watched there, this 1963 film, Mr. Twister, in which we see an African-American gentleman being struck in the face when trying to enter a whites-only establishment, but also forms of systemic oppression and racism that were affecting musicians themselves as they tried to navigate careers in the music.
Thank you, Ian. We probably have time for one more question. So seeing none at the moment, maybe we should wrap up here. And Ian, let me thank you for wrapping up our semester with such a wide-ranging and wonderful and insightful talk that took on conventional periodizations and global movements, and also framed all of these things within a concise and precise view of what you and some of your collaborators think is going on here and its significance. It was really a delightful presentation, and I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you to our attendees as well, and we will see you when things start up again here at Yale in February. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you so much for having me today.
You bet.